He signed the divorce papers while she was still unconscious on the operating table. 3 premature babies fighting for their lives in the NICU, and he called them unforeseen liabilities. He canceled her insurance. He stripped her name from every account. He moved her to the cheapest room in the hospital with no view, no comfort, and $47 to her name. He thought he had erased her. He thought power meant control. He was wrong. Because the woman he tried to destroy was sitting on a fortune he never knew existed. And every move he made to crush her became the signature on his own downfall. This is the story of Grant Holloway, a man who confused cruelty with strategy, and Marilyn Lynn Parker, the wife who didn't fight back. She simply waited for him to destroy himself. True power is not what you take from others. It is what remains when everything is taken from you. If this story hits you, if you've ever been underestimated, dismissed, or told you were nothing, stay until the very end. Drop a comment, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and if you haven't yet, subscribe and hit that bell. You don't want to miss what...
He signed the divorce papers while she was still unconscious on the operating table. 3 premature babies fighting for their lives in the NICU, and he called them unforeseen liabilities. He canceled her insurance. He stripped her name from every account. He moved her to the cheapest room in the hospital with no view, no comfort, and $47 to her name. He thought he had erased her. He thought power meant control. He was wrong. Because the woman he tried to destroy was sitting on a fortune he never knew existed, and every move he made to crush her became the signature on his own downfall. This is the story of Grant Holloway, a man who confused cruelty with strategy, and Marilyn Lynn Parker, the wife who didn't fight back. She simply waited for him to destroy himself. True power is not what you take from others. It is what remains when everything is taken from you. If this story hits you, if you've ever been underestimated, dismissed, or told you were nothing, stay until the very end. Drop a comment, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and if you haven't yet, subscribe and hit that bell. You don't want to miss, what this was a necessary cut. The hospital smelled of clean solutions, a sterile place for a sterile procedure. Behind those doors lay a problem that had grown malignant, a complication. I held the pen. This was not an act of cruelty. It was an act of survival. My signature was the scalpel. I was saving my life's work. 10 minutes ago, the liability had almost expired on its own. Now I simply had to complete the severance. The lawyer asked if I was certain. I asked how quickly it could be done. The answer was immediate. Final, clean, just as it should be. A doctor appeared, her face a mask of pointless fatigue. "Your wife is critical," she began. "That name no longer applies," I corrected her. The folder was closed. It was a finished transaction. "Update her next of kin." "She has none," the doctor said. "A perfect clean slate." I nodded. My work here was done. I walked away. My shoes made a sharp, decisive sound on the polished floor. I passed images of other people's sentimental choices. They were warnings. In the incubators behind me were 3 unforeseen expenses. Lynn would awaken to a new reality, one I had carefully constructed for her, free of obligation. My car was waiting in the garage, engine humming with potential. My phone glowed with a single question from Belle. "Is it done?" I replied with one word. "Yes." Pulling into the city's current, I felt a sense of rightness. The timing was flawless. No emotional entanglement, no weakness. In 6 weeks, my company faced its defining moment. It required a leader, not a husband. Investors buy strength. They short sentiment. Up on that floor, a nurse was tending to the assets. The babies were alive. That was a medical fact. Lynn's reaction was a predictable, emotional variable I had now contained. What no one understood was the simple truth of my world. I had not destroyed a family. I had liquidated a failing asset. My decision was not a mistake. It was a strategic necessity. Lynn Parker would wake to the sound of hospital machinery, a body that felt hollowed out, a loss she could not yet name. Her throat would be raw, her mind would be a fog of drugs and confusion. She would not remember the clean cut of the knife. Then the pain would return, a body reminding her of its own failure. She would try to move, and the incision would remind her of the price. A nurse would offer useless comfort. She would ask for the children, my children. Her voice would be a broken thing. The nurse would pause, a professional hesitation. They are in the neonatal unit, she would say. They are stable. Tears of relief would be her first mistake. She would think she still had a claim. Can I see them? Then the truth would arrive. An administrator I had hired would enter the room holding a device. He would wear a badge that confirmed his purpose. Mrs. Parker, he would begin, before issuing the correction. Miss Parker, in room 202, the word would strike with surgical precision. Your marital status has changed, he would state. The divorce was finalized this morning. She would stare, her mind refusing the logic. That is not possible. I was unconscious. Yes, he would confirm. The authorization was valid. Her heart would beat like a trapped thing. He would not do this. He already did. The screen would show her the truth. My signature, clear and unwavering, her name, printed below. It was all there. A clean and final record. You are no longer on Mr. Holloway's insurance plan. The hospital has moved your room. Custody of the children is now under my sole authority. Her hands would clutch the sheets. Those are my children. Her claim was irrelevant. That is being determined, he would say. The world would dissolve into noise. Where is he? She would demand. I need my husband. The administrator would meet her gaze. Mr. Holloway has chosen to end all contact. Later, a wheelchair would arrive. She would be moved to a smaller room, a less expensive room. No view, no comfort, just forms to sign. Her new reality. Later, they would wheel her past the glass. She would see the incubators, 3 small forms fighting a battle I was funding. She would reach out, but the chair would continue its journey. She would finally understand. It was not a divorce. It was an erasure. And as she lay in that quiet room, holding a plastic bracelet I had already paid for, a knock would come to her door. Someone else's problem now. I stood before the mirror in my home. My cuffs were perfect. The city stretched out below me, a grid of power and order. My power, my order. The world was quiet. It was controlled. It was clean, just as I had designed it. My phone chimed, a reminder. Investor breakfast at 9 a.m. I sipped my coffee. I scanned the overnight messages. Congratulations. Inquiries, no dissent. The severance was executed flawlessly. I felt no fatigue. I felt streamlined. The hospital was a memory of someone else's crisis. No more emotional burdens. No more illogical demands. Lynn had become a risk the moment the doctor confirmed complications. 3 premature children are not a gift. They are a vulnerability. And I eliminate vulnerabilities. I dialed Belle's number, a number I knew by heart. It is done, I said. I could hear the smile in her voice, the sound of victory. I told you it would work. You just needed to be decisive. I always am, I replied. She was waiting for me at the hotel that night. A strategic appearance, a soft launch for my new life, a partner who enhanced my value instead of draining it. The elevator ascended, and I felt a deep satisfaction. The story was mine now. I was the leader who made the necessary choice, the man who did not let personal sentiment compromise professional ambition. No one would even remember her name. By mid-morning, I was at the head of the table. Wall Street was my backdrop. I held my pen and spoke of the future. I detailed growth. I projected strength. My confidence was absolute. This company is at its strongest point, I said. We have no distractions, no instability. The men across the table believed me. Then my assistant entered. She leaned in. Sir, there's a problem with a funding source. I kept my expression neutral. Which one? The Parker Hale Trust. The name was a ghost. We do not have dealings with them. Not directly, she said. But they influence two of our partners. They have frozen their capital. I leaned back. A temporary issue. Yes, she confirmed. But they are asking for updated disclosures on personal risk. My jaw set. I will handle it. The meeting went on, but the air had changed. For the first time, I felt a trace of something unwelcome. I pushed it aside. I had lawyers. I had power. This was nothing. My phone buzzed again. An unknown number. I declined the call. Across the city, in a room I had paid for, Marilyn Lynn Parker existed. Her name had surfaced in a place I thought was sealed. As I stood to close the deal, certain the past was severed, the message I rejected sat on my screen. The system I mastered was turning against me. The woman I had erased had become a variable I could no longer predict. The pen felt good in my hand. It moved with clean, efficient purpose. Every signature was a snip, cutting a cord that should have been severed months ago. I pictured the paperwork moving through the hospital system. A series of quiet, logical steps. Orders followed, changes made. The private suite was a mistake, an emotional expense. Now, we were back to reality, back to practicality. This was not cruelty. It was a correction, a necessary adjustment to an untenable situation. I felt no anger. I felt no regret. I felt only the calm that comes from making a difficult but correct decision. The chaos was contained. The future was being secured. She would call it heartless. I called it responsible. The hospital has procedures for these things, for people who cannot pay. Responsibility is a simple word. You create a debt, you assume the debt. She had made a series of poor choices. This was simply the consequence. The authorization was terminated this morning. Those words were a firewall, a clean break. I imagined the coordinator explaining the situation, the quiet professional tone. Some might see 3 infants. I saw 3 unforeseen liabilities, an unacceptable drain on resources. My resources, my future. This was not about them. It was about protecting what I had built from what she had become. She had to leave the hospital. Medically, she was stable. The rest was not my concern. A home is something you maintain. A life is something you build. She had failed to do both. This was not my fault. It was the natural outcome of her dependency. I felt a surge of something like clarity. The world is built on rules, on cause and effect. I was not being cruel. I was simply allowing the rules to apply. Paperwork and policy are not instruments of torture. They are the architecture of an orderly world. I was restoring order. Her panic was not my problem to solve. It was hers to manage. I blocked her number. The messages stopped. The silence was a relief, a clean space where emotion could not reach me. I sat in my quiet apartment, everything in its place. This was what I worked for, this order, this control. It was not personal, I told myself again. It was a strategic decision, a necessary amputation. Hospitals have contingency plans. People find a way, or they do not. That is not my burden to carry. I let the thought drift away. She was an error in judgment, an error that was now corrected. The tremors were over. The ground beneath my feet felt solid once more. The system is designed for this. It is a machine of policies and budgets. Compassion is a variable it cannot afford. I trusted the administrators, the people with the clipboards. They understand numbers. They understand liability. A doctor might feel a moment of misplaced empathy, but the system would correct for it. The system always does. It finds the path of least financial resistance. I had simply pointed it in the right direction. It was a beautiful, impersonal process. Her name and the names of her children were just data points now. Entries on a ledger that needed to be balanced. And I had balanced them. I looked at the quarterly reports on my screen. Numbers rising and falling, clear, logical, predictable. It is how the world should work. A doctor who acts on emotion is a liability, a risk to the institution. My actions were legally sound, airtight. There was no room for interpretation, no space for a challenge. She had no resources, no allies. I had made sure of it. This was a game of power. I held all the pieces. I had anticipated every move. I felt the satisfying calm of complete control. The situation was resolved. The file was closed. The work was done. This city runs on contracts, on agreements written and signed, not on feelings. I thought about her family name for a moment. Parker. It meant nothing, a faded name from a forgotten branch of her family tree. It was irrelevant. She was irrelevant. I felt a deep sense of peace. The storm had passed. I had navigated it perfectly. My life was my own again, uncluttered, uncompromised. There was no one to answer to, no one to challenge my decisions. I was secure. I was free. The thought of some unknown lawyer was absurd. A fantasy. The board was clear. I had already won. I slept soundly that night, the sleep of a man unburdened, a man who had solved his greatest problem. There were no ghosts in my quiet apartment, no lingering whispers of doubt. My conscience was clear because my actions were logical. What I did was not just for me, it was for the principle of order itself. Somewhere, a balance was shifting, but not in my world. In my world, everything was perfectly still, exactly as I had designed it. I was the architect of my own peace, and the foundation was unshakable. There would be no consequences. Because I had erased the cause, I tidied my desk, papers filed, pens aligned. It was a ritual of closure, every object in its place. I was erasing the last traces of her, boxing up a past I no longer needed. It felt good. Final. I imagined her in that hospital room, alone, frightened, powerless. The image did not disturb me. It affirmed my decision. It was necessary. While I created my perfect order, I had no way of knowing that a quiet man was walking down a hospital corridor, that a door was about to open, and that my clean, simple solution was about to become a catastrophic complication. I reviewed my own portfolio. The numbers were strong, solid, a testament to careful planning and a lack of sentimentality. My wealth was a fortress. It protected me. It defined me. I remembered her mentioning a grandmother, some old woman who had died years ago. It was just a story, a pointless piece of family history. I dismissed the memory. It was noise, data without value. I was secure in what I knew, in what I could see and measure. I possessed all the facts that mattered. My reality was built on a foundation of concrete numbers, and it was impenetrable. My plan was flawless. The liabilities were isolated. The assets were protected. She had nothing. She was nothing. The birth of those children, the very event she thought would trap me, was the trigger for her own ruin. I felt a grim satisfaction in the irony. She had sealed her own fate. Hope was a delusion for the weak. I had no illusions. I had a strategy, and it had worked perfectly. I switched off the light, content. The future was a clean, empty page. I did not realize my actions had just written the first chapter of a story I could not control. I chose not to see. I chose to be blind. It was a necessary amputation. Removing her was the only way to save the future of my children. She called it cruelty, this financial pressure. I called it clarity. Lynn was a creature of chaos, of emotion. Legacy requires discipline. She could never understand that. The trust documents were a firewall, built to protect our lineage from precisely this kind of instability. I was not harming her, I was protecting them. Everything I did was for them. Her tears were a regrettable but temporary cost. Her pain was insignificant next to the permanence of what I was building. She thought herself erased. She was merely being corrected, put back in her proper place. Far from the levers of power, she was never equipped to handle. The 90-day review was a kindness, a formal window for her to accept the inevitable. I arranged her discharge. I was aware of her finances, down to the last dollar, $47, a fitting sum for a woman who never understood value. It was essential that she feel the full weight of her helplessness. Only then would she surrender the children to my care without a destructive fight. I imagined her leaving the hospital, a ghost in a borrowed coat. It did not bring me joy. It brought a quiet sense of order. The plan was working. Her destination was irrelevant. Any place she went would be a temporary stop on her journey toward accepting my terms. It was all for the best, for everyone. Her daily visits were predictable, a mother's sentiment. It had no bearing on the larger strategy. The hospital was a sterile environment, controlled. My children were safe there, safer than they would be with her. I had the custody papers delivered, a clean official step. There was no emotion in the act. It was a business decision for the good of the primary assets, my heirs. I felt no need to visit them myself. My role was not at the bedside. My role was to secure the world they would one day inherit. Her vigil behind the glass was a pointless gesture. Touching them would change nothing about her inability to provide for them. Her love was not a currency the world accepted. I expected she would find a lawyer. Desperate people do desperate things. The trust was a minor complication, a legal tangle I would unravel. So, she knew something. It did not matter. Knowledge without power is useless. My life continued. A portrait of success and stability with Belle. The photographs were not a performance. They were a promise of the orderly future I was creating. A world without Lynn's unpredictable storms. She was not unwell. She was unsuited. There is a difference. My narrative was not a lie. It was a carefully constructed truth designed to protect my children from a damaging reality. From her. The report on the child's crisis was irritating. A flaw in the bloodline, a sign of inherited fragility that I would have to manage. It strengthened my resolve. They needed my strength, my resources, my control. Lynn's empty promises whispered in a hallway were meaningless. Her exhaustion was the intended result of my strategy. 90 days was a generous timeline for her to fall. I waited for the call, the message of surrender. Instead, there was only silence. I assumed it was the quiet of despair, a woman finally breaking. I did not know it was the quiet of a weapon being loaded by someone else, a name I did not yet know. The markets were volatile. I spent the day in a series of punishing meetings, securing a hostile acquisition. This was the real world, a world of predators and prey. Lynn never understood that. She lived in a fantasy of feelings and intentions. I chose her for her softness, thinking it could be shaped. I was wrong. Her softness was a form of weakness, a rot. Ethan Cole was a bottom feeder. I dismissed him. He could not touch me. The name Julian Cross was not on my radar. It existed in a world I could not see, a world that was, at that moment, preparing to move against me. While I conquered titans, a ghost was meeting my wife. I reviewed a portfolio that afternoon. Billions of dollars, shifting with a single command. That was power. True power. Not the petty emotional leverage Lynn tried to wield. I was building an empire for my sons, an impenetrable fortress. She spoke of help. I had offered her the only help that mattered, a clean break, a quiet life away from responsibilities she could not handle. I felt no guilt. Guilt is a useless emotion, a luxury for those without consequence. I imagined her in some cheap room, finally understanding her place. I did not imagine her in a clean office, being handed a lifeline by an enemy I did not know I had. I made my moves on the board with precision. The custody threat, the financial drain, the public narrative. Each was designed to corner her, to force a resignation. It was a flawless strategy. Any rational opponent would have folded, but she was not rational. I waited for the panicked calls, the desperate legal filings. Nothing came. Her silence was perplexing. I assumed it was the paralysis of a defeated mind. I mistook patience for weakness. I did not know another player was advising her, someone who understood that the most powerful move is sometimes no move at all. While I waited for her to react, she was being taught how to wait. 2 weeks of silence. It began to feel unnatural. I had reports sent to me. She had moved. A small apartment, a minor detail. Some charity, I assumed. A temporary reprieve. It did not change the outcome. I continued to file motions. I let the pressure build. I waited for the crack to appear. It never did. The silence from her side of the board was absolute. It was the calm before a storm I did not see coming. I thought I was the storm. I thought her silence was surrender. It was the ground solidifying under her feet. And I, the great Grant Holloway, never even felt the tremor. The silence became a presence in my office, an empty space where her predictable hysterics should have been. I told myself it was victory. She was broken, overwhelmed, gone. Yet, the absence of data was unsettling. Control requires information, and I had none. I scoffed at my assistant, but the question echoed in my mind. Where was she? The court filings were dormant. The hospital reports were clinical. Nothing matched the picture of the collapse I had so carefully engineered. At dinner, Belle's words were a cold spark. It was her name, spoken by others. A name that should have been fading into obscurity. Her name in a funding discussion. Parker Hale, not Lynn, the name of the dormant empire. That was what they were watching. A sleeping giant. My jaw tightened. It was not nothing. My call to the legal team was no longer a request. It was a demand. The report they gave me was thin because I was looking in the wrong place. I had focused on the woman, not her name. I had targeted a person, forgetting she was attached to a legacy. I had waged a war on a soldier, never realizing she was the key to the fortress. I stood looking out at the city I owned, and for the first time, I felt the chill of a game I was no longer controlling. This was about order. It was about stability. My short calls were surgical, precise. Giving her silence was a strategy, a tool to let her reveal her own chaos. Every word she spoke would have been a thread in a rope of her own making, and she refused. So, I had to act. I pushed the custody motion forward. It was necessary to highlight her emotional distance, her rootless life. The press needed a narrative, a gentle nudge toward the truth. I simply provided one. What followed was a void. No outburst, no desperate plea, just a wall of infuriating silence. Then, the tremors began. An investor meeting was postponed. Another followed. A third asked questions about personal matters, trivialities, market jitters. Then I found the memo, a document not meant for my eyes. It spoke of an old trust, a relic, her family's legacy. My fingers hovered, cold. The name on the page was Parker Hale. She was meant to be the one afraid of the silence, not me. She was supposed to understand that stillness was surrender, but the ground was moving under my feet. I had misjudged the battlefield. So I pushed again, harder. I would not be trapped by a ghost. It was time for a show of strength. In my world, silence was a vacuum, and power abhorred a vacuum. If my partners were nervous, if rumors were spreading, the answer was simple. I would be seen. I would be solid. I had to shape the story before it could shape me. The charity event at the plaza was the perfect stage. Chandeliers dripped light. Tuxedos dotted the room. This was my world, the financial heart of the city, all gathered and watching. I made my entrance at the precise moment. Belle was an anchor on my arm, her presence a statement. The cameras flashed. She wore a pristine ivory dress. I wore absolute control. She whispered for me to smile. They were watching. I did. I moved through the room with purpose. My laughter was effortless. My words were about vision and strength. I spoke of a future clear of all complications. When a question about my private life surfaced, my answer was ready. Sometimes, I explained, you must make difficult choices to protect what matters. The words landed perfectly. I saw the nods, the quiet agreement. The whispers I heard were not about her. They were about my resolve, my command. I looked invincible. The familiar feeling of victory settled in. This was my arena. This was my domain. Belle moved closer as we stood by the balcony. She confirmed what I already knew. They were on my side. I surveyed the room, my kingdom, and then I saw him. Ethan Cole. He was standing by the bar, a flicker of tension, quickly masked. Cole was not an ally or an enemy. He was an outcome. Our eyes met across the room. He gave a small, formal nod. Nothing else. I told myself it was nothing. I was deep in conversation with a fund manager when my phone buzzed. I let it be. It buzzed again. And again. With practiced annoyance, I excused myself. I found a quiet hallway and looked at the screen. The message was from my chief financial officer. We have a problem. My response was instant. Be specific. Thanks for watching. His reply was slower. A primary investor has pulled back. They mentioned concerns about a legacy trust review. A knot formed in my gut. Which trust? The dots pulsed, then vanished. The name appeared. Parker Hale. The air in the corridor grew thick. I typed with fury. That is dormant. It is not a factor. We thought so, he wrote back. But someone is making people believe it is. And please, I put the phone away, my posture rigid. I walked back into the grand ballroom. My smile was a mask. My laughter was a shield. But the music sounded harsh now. The golden room felt like it was closing in. She was somewhere in the city, hiding in a hospital, holding our children. She knew nothing of this gala. She did not need to. While I was projecting my strength to the world itself was starting to fracture beneath me. This time, I knew no amount of confidence could seal the cracks. The expected media storm never arrived. This unnerved me more than any attack. My name remained in the financial pages, always beside words like resilience and leadership. But the tone underneath was different. Invitations arrived less frequently. My calls were returned more slowly. Meetings once set in stone were now pending review. And she remained a ghost. I sat in my office, the city waking up outside my window. My fingers tapped on the glass. My assistant stood before me like a statue. I cannot find her, she said. There are no new records, no filings. She has not responded to a single notice. My jaw tightened. She is hiding. Or maybe, my assistant offered, she does not have to respond. I gave her a look that silenced her. In the hushed rooms across the city, a new story was taking shape. Not in the papers, but in quiet conversations. The Parker Hale Trust. The name was being spoken again. Who was behind it? Why was it active now? Why her? Ethan Cole's name started appearing on schedules. Julian Cross vanished from 2 events. A partner sold a small piece of my latest venture. It was nothing. It was everything. I tried to force her hand. It was the only way I knew. My lawyers requested a psychiatric evaluation. The language was clinical, professional. It cited postpartum distress. It was a reasonable, necessary step. I was met with silence. The court simply filed the request. That evening, I stood with a glass in my hand, watching the lights below. Belle had not come home. I did not care. My mind was fixed on one thought. She should have broken by now. Her days, I imagined, were small and quiet. The babies were growing stronger. She was learning to sit with them, to exist in their fragile world. Julian Cross came and went. I received a report. He told her she was doing well. She said she was surviving. She never asked about me. Ethan gave her updates. He is growing impatient, he told her. Lynn had apparently replied, "Good." "Why?" he asked. "Because impatience creates error." A nurse at the hospital let something slip. A journalist had called, asking if Lynn Parker was a patient. My hands would have stilled. "What did you say?" The nurse had followed protocol. "We cannot confirm patient information." She was winning by disappearing. I had wanted the world to see her crumble. Instead, she had vanished. No interviews, no dramatic pictures, no weakness. In a city built on being seen, her absence became a weapon. It made people ask questions. What did she know? Who was helping? Her? What was she planning? I felt it then, a cold shift. I was no longer driving events. I was reacting to them. And deep inside the world I commanded, Marilyn Lynn Parker was becoming a name whispered with caution, a force to be calculated. So I decided to reach out. Not with lawyers, not for the press, directly. The message was carefully sent through a private channel. "We need to talk," I wrote. "For the children, for closure." She read it in some small, anonymous apartment, a baby asleep on her chest. The others, finally stable. She did not reply to me. She sent my message to Ethan Cole. His response was immediate. "Good. He is ready." To what? The meeting was arranged for 3 days later. A neutral location I selected. A conference room I knew well. I needed every advantage. I needed control. She agreed to my terms. I was there first, waiting by the window. I turned as she entered. My face was a study in carefully practiced concern. Softened. Reasonable. "Lynn," I said, "you look exhausted. I am tired." She ignored the bait. She sat down opposite me. Her hands were still. Her posture was calm, almost withdrawn. It was exactly what I had hoped to see. "This will not be a war," I started. "We can end this before the children are hurt." "The children are in the hospital," Lynn said. This had to be done calmly. Chaos was a disease. I nodded, conceding the obvious point. "For stability," I said. "Markets detest uncertainty. Investors even more so." This was a truth she needed to accept. My attorneys have prepared a solution. It was a simple, elegant path forward. A cooperative arrangement means shared custody, controlled payments, absolute silence. It resolves everything. I slid the folder toward her. The proposal inside was more than fair. Monthly support. A housing stipend. Her legal bills paid. In return, she would simply let go. No future claims, no public drama, no interference. I watched her read. Her hands were still. Her face was a placid mask. "This is generous," she said. Her voice was quiet. I allowed myself to relax. Just a fraction. "I am a fair man." She looked at me then. "Why do this now?" "Because a clean break is better." This was an act of mercy, I told myself. A clean end is better than a messy fight. I knew she was exhausted. The lie felt like truth on my tongue. Her eyes fell, a sign of surrender. She did not want to fight. She was tired. Good. I slid my hand near hers, a gesture of finality. Just sign it. Let me clean this up for both of us. The silence was her acceptance. She finally agreed. Relief washed over me, a brief, sharp tide. I pushed the pen toward her. A heavy, expensive instrument for a simple task. She never saw the other page tucked beneath. A safeguard. Business is always about safeguards. Ethan Cole knew that. She signed where I pointed. One line, then another. A few small marks in the margins. I added my signature last, my mind already on the next deal. The chapter was closing. It was done. I stood, offering my hand. This was the best way, I said. She took my hand. She even thanked me. As she left, a smile found my lips. The problem was finally solved. I did not understand that the paper I held was not an ending. It was a beginning. I had acknowledged a cage I never saw. I had handed her the key. The first blow came at 6:42 in the morning. I was in the middle of my workout. The city was still waking up. My phone vibrated on the cold marble. My chief financial officer. A call this early was always a bad omen. What is it? I demanded. We have a problem, he said. His voice was strained. 3 of our partners have frozen all their capital. I grabbed a towel. Is it temporary? No, it is indefinite. They are citing issues with clause alignment. My jaw tightened. Which clauses? The silence on the line was too long. The ones in the amended agreement from last week, he said. The one with the protected beneficiary language. A flicker of anger. That was standard boilerplate. That is what we all thought, he said. Our lawyers see it differently now. I ended the call. By 9 o'clock, my inbox was a disaster. Clarification requests. Postponed meetings. My calendar, once a monument to order, was bleeding uncertainty. I sat at my desk, spinning my pen, forcing myself to be calm. I had signed thousands of documents. I do not make mistakes like this. My assistant knocked. She entered without permission. Legal is waiting for you. In the conference room, 2 of them sat. Their faces were grim. A third screen showed the paragraph from Lynn's agreement. This addendum, the first lawyer said, it activates disclosure duties under the trust. I leaned forward. What trust? The room became perfectly quiet. The Parker Hale Trust, he said. Your signature confirms you knew of its activation. I laughed. A sharp, ugly sound. That trust is dead. It is not, the lawyer said. It is active. My stomach turned to ice. Since when? Since the birth of your children. The words landed like stones. So, you are saying, I said slowly, that I confirmed a trust I did not know existed. Yes, he said, and any action you took could now be seen as coercion. I stood up so fast the chair scraped back. This is absurd. She has no access to any of it yet. Access is not the issue, the second one said. Protection is. By noon, the poison had spread. A private equity group wanted new disclosures. Another demanded an internal audit. My next funding round was suddenly under review. I locked my office door. My hands were flat on the desk. My breathing was shallow. I saw her face in my mind, her tired voice, her downcast eyes. How easily she had agreed. I had seen weakness where there was a weapon. Across town, Lynn was meeting with her lawyers. I could picture it. No celebration, just cold strategy. It is moving faster now, one would say. Your signature did more than we hoped. He is exposed, another would add. He knows it now. Lynn would look at her hands. What comes next? The lawyer would meet her gaze. Now he will panic. As if summoned, my name lit up her phone. She would not answer. In my office, I stared at the screen. The anger was a fire. Under it, a layer of ice. Fear. For the first time, I understood what had happened. Marilyn Lynn Parker was not waiting for me to be kind. She was waiting for me to condemn myself. And as the market began to turn away from me, the empire I built on absolute control began to crack. Signature by signature, the boardroom on the 42nd floor was my throne. I had run this world from that table. Today, I stood at the window. I watched the city below. The traffic seemed slow. The world was mocking me. My own board had called this emergency meeting. That told me everything. I knew how bad it was. I turned. The room was filling up. Lawyers, advisors, two investors who never came to these things. No one looked at me for long. The air was thick with unspoken accusations. Then the door opened one last time. I expected another suit. It was Marilyn Lynn Parker. The room fell silent. She was not dressed for war. Just a simple navy dress. Understated. Her hair was pulled back. She was calm. She was not the fragile woman I remembered. She looked powerful. My breath caught in my throat. "What is she doing here?" I demanded. Her lawyer stepped in behind her. "She is here by my invitation," he said. His voice was flat. And with the consent of the board, whispers moved around the table. Lynn looked at me then. Her eyes held no anger, no victory, only a strange clarity that unnerved me more than her rage ever could. She sat down near the end of the table. She folded her hands, the same way she did in my office. So familiar, so false. "Let us begin," the chairman said. "Mr. Holloway, we are aware of certain developments, of your personal litigation exposure and its impact on this company." I opened my mouth, but she spoke first. "I will not take much of your time," she said. Her voice filled the quiet room. "I am not here about our marriage. I am here about risk." Heads turned. Everyone looked at her. "The Parker Hale Trust," she continued, "has completed its activation review. While the assets are still restricted, all beneficiary protections are now in force. It was a matter of order, control. I was only enforcing the structure that kept everything afloat." Then the words appeared on the screen. Coercive, retaliatory, absurd. I started to speak, to correct this narrative. Julian's voice cut through mine. He presented documentation, my signature, my filings, all twisted into a grotesque caricature of my intentions. Lynn spoke, her voice a weapon of false calm. "It is about accountability." The board chair looked at her. "Damages?" She shook her head. No, she wanted distance between her children and me. It was a performance, a well-rehearsed assassination. They watched. These men I had made wealthy. I could feel their loyalties shifting. "You planned this," I said. The words were quiet. She met my eyes. "No, Grant. I survived it." Then she was gone. Julian followed, a loyal dog. The door clicked shut. I stood there, the head of the table, a king in a room full of silent judges. She had not screamed. She had not begged. She had simply held up a distorted mirror to my world, and they believed the reflection. The collapse was silent. By noon, my authority began to dissolve. Confirmed meetings vanished from my calendar. Calls from investors were not missed. They were ignored. In the hallways, the air grew thin when I approached. Men who had built their careers on my favor now found the floor fascinating. Their jokes were gone. Their loyalty was gone. At 1:17 in the afternoon, they summoned me again. This time, I did not command the room. I sat, my hands locked together on the polished wood, a mask of control. Their postures had changed. They were observers now, detached. "We have reviewed the risk," the chair said. "The external pressure." "A passing storm," I replied. "More than turbulence," one of them dared to say. "3 funds have withdrawn." My head snapped up. Paused, he clarified. "Pending an outcome." A coldness spread through my gut. The outcome of my leadership. The word hung in the air. A lawyer slid a document toward me. Your choices have created a vulnerability, a risk to the company's reputation. I pushed it back. This company is my life. It is me. The chair looked at me without deference. That was once an asset. The silence was an answer. We are invoking the contingency clause. He said, Yes, Sam, he said. An interim chief executive officer. A bitter laugh escaped my lips. You are removing me over a domestic dispute. We are protecting the company, he answered. From you. Miles away, she was in a hospital, holding a child. A picture of fragile victory. It was all a game of appearances. Her phone buzzed. She ignored it. Of course she did. Back in that room, my room, I stood up. My jacket felt heavy. You are making a terrible mistake, I said. She has no power. The board's lawyer repeated Julian's words. Access is not the point. Influence is. Thank you for watching. My words failed me. For the first time, I had no argument left. The memo was a masterpiece of corporate language. Transition, realignment. The market did not panic. It simply paused. It waited. My penthouse was empty. Belle was gone. A note on the counter. I need space. It meant nothing. I stood by the window with a glass of whiskey I did not drink. I had built an empire on their belief in me, and I was learning just how fragile belief could be. I finally understood the weight of it all. It settled on me, a crushing, silent force. But I did not see the real truth. This was not the end. It was the beginning of a long fall. Belle's absence was a minor inconvenience at first. Her invitations stopped. Her social calendar emptied. She claimed it was a slow week. Denial. She would sit in cafes, staring at her phone, watching the lives of women she once considered peers, women who were still inside the circle. Her name had become associated with my perceived weakness, a fatal flaw in her world. Just weeks ago, my name was her key to everything. Now it was a lock. The whispers were the worst part. She could not confront them. She picked the wrong side. She thought she was permanent. She still thought she had me. She came to the penthouse unannounced. The key I gave her felt like a distant memory. I was by the window. The city felt like an enemy. You should have told me, she said. Told you what? That your world was collapsing. Her voice was sharp. I am being shut out. I finally turned to face her. This is not about you. It is about me when your problems destroy my reputation. I laughed. A hollow sound. Your reputation, I said. She stood beside power. That is all. She was beginning to understand it was never her own. That was the truth that cut her so deeply. Her agency called the next morning. The meeting was brief. 12 minutes to erase her. They used words like conflict and instability. Her contract was not renewed. Another client called. Another door closed. Meanwhile, Lynn's name was spoken differently now, with caution, with respect. Belle made one final, desperate move. She contacted a reporter, offered to sell her version of my story. The story was never published. A warning came back instead. Stay away from her. That night, she packed. There were no words, just the quiet sounds of her surrender. She left the key on the counter, next to my untouched glass. Across town, Lynn was with the children. She did not know Belle existed. She did not have to. The woman who tried to replace her learned a simple lesson. You cannot stand with a man who burns everything around him. You just burn with him. Belle vanished from the rooms she fought so hard to enter, and the consequences of my choices continued to spread. A fire I could no longer control. I stood outside the hospital for almost 10 minutes. The building was the same, but my place in the world had shifted. The revolving door was no longer an entrance I owned. It was a barrier. I smoothed my coat, a reflex, an old habit of command. I walked inside. May I help you? I am here to see Marilyn Parker. I kept my voice low. The name felt foreign. The receptionist checked her system. She is not listed under that surname. I swallowed. Lynn? A pause. Room 612. Visiting hours end in 20 minutes. I nodded. I walked away before she could see the crack in my composure. The hallway was silent. My footsteps were too loud. I stopped at the door. My hand hesitated. What could I possibly say? An apology was a language I never learned. Admitting error was a useless tactic. This was about restoring order. I knew that now. When I knocked, her voice was steady. Come in. She sat by the window. One child was in her arms. Two others slept in baskets nearby. City lights bathed her in a calm glow. She looked tired but solid, unbreakable in a way I had never seen. I closed the door. You look well. She ignored the pleasantry. Why are you here? The bluntness was a surprise. I had to see you, I said. Uridan, we need to talk. Lynn shifted the baby, then met my eyes. We had plenty of time to talk. I breathed out. I did not grasp the situation then. No, she replied, her voice flat. You grasped it. You had just saw it as inconvenient. And we're teacher. I flinched. That is not fair. She tilted her head. Is it not? The silence was an accusation. The monitor hummed softly. My certainty began to fray in the quiet. I have lost the company, I said at last. The board removed me. The investors are gone. Everything has changed. Lynn just listened, her face a mask. I never wanted it to get this far, I told her. That is the problem, she said, her voice quiet. You never believed it would. If you could, for I moved closer, my voice low, we can still fix this. For the children, the word was a tool. A heavy one. Lynn's eyes hardened, not with rage, but with a terrible finality. You cannot use them anymore. They are my children, I insisted. And you abandoned them before they took their first breath, she answered. Her voice never rose. It was a business decision. My shoulders slumped. I made miscalculations. Yes, Lynn said. And miscalculations have consequences. And 40. I looked at the small family I had nearly erased. I do not want this fight. I do not need a fight, Lynn said. I need you gone, Grant. Opened my mouth, but no argument came. There was no leverage, no power, only a regret that was useless now. I will accept your terms, I said, my voice hollow. She gave a single nod. You will accept the court's terms. I turned to the door, my hand on the cold metal. You became stronger than I imagined. Lynn looked at me one last time. I did not become strong. I just remembered I always was. I left. I said nothing else. She looked at the child in her arms, breathing, existing. She kissed his head, her heart finally steady, because the man who thought he owned her world had returned, only to find he had no place in it at all. The hearing was set for a Tuesday morning. The courthouse smelled of cleaning fluid and weak coffee. Marilyn Lynn Parker came in quietly. She was dressed plainly. No lawyers swarmed her. Julian Cross was there, but only to the gate. She walked the rest of the way alone. She did not need protection anymore. I was already seated when she entered. I felt thin. My confidence scraped down to bone. My lawyer whispered things. They sounded like lines from a script. When Lynn sat down, I met her eyes for a moment. Then I had to look away. The judge arrived. Her eyes were weary. Her voice was sharp. She had seen it all before. We are here for custodial authority over the Parker Holloway children, she stated. Begin, my attorney spoke. He talked of stability. He talked of resources. They were the right words, the logical ones. He mentioned Lynn's medical issues, her temporary home, her lack of an income. He framed my actions as concern. When Lynn stood, she was calm. I am not here to discuss my finances, she said. I am here to discuss my presence. Her lawyer provided the records, hospital charts, visitor logs, statements from the staff. Dr. Naomi Reed's words were precise. They were clinical. They were a blade. These babies are alive because their mother was there, Dr. Reed said. Always. When the coverage was cut, when support ended, when everything was leveraged against her, she stayed. My lawyer tried to object. The judge ignored him. Then came the money. Not my wealth, just my actions. The canceled insurance, the timing, the clear, cold pattern. I shifted in my chair. The judge looked at me. Mr. Holloway, she said, did you not terminate the medical insurance just after your wife's surgery? I paused. I was following legal advice. And did you not, the judge pressed on, that these actions occurred during sensitive corporate negotiations? There was only silence. The judgment was fast. The mother receives primary physical and legal custody, the judge declared. Supervised visits only, after counseling. My whole body sagged. Lynn showed nothing. She just breathed out. I had to stop her outside. This is not fair, I said. Lynn turned. Her eyes held no anger. It is just, you are removing me, I said. No, she replied. You removed yourself. I simply locked the door. She walked away from me, into the light. Julianne was waiting for her on the steps. It is over, Lynn said. He nodded. Good. That night, Lynn went back to a small apartment. 3 cribs were there. She went to each one. She touched each small life she had protected. A message appeared on her phone. From Ethan. The custody order is final. Lynn allowed a small smile. For once, no threat hung over her. No fear. No one held power over her life. Because the system had finally chosen. I, Grant Holloway, lost the final piece I thought I could command that day. It was not the company. It was not my reputation. It was the belief that power was the same as love. The apartment was different in the morning. Not grander, not wealthier, just silent in a way I had never known. The quiet was not peace. It was an absence, a void. Sunlight found 3 empty spaces in a guest room that were meant to be full. Wall. Each a testament to a future that had vanished. Marilyn Lynn Parker stood on some cheap floor, drinking coffee. Real coffee, not the bitter sludge from a hospital machine. She watched her children, my children, and felt a calm settle in her bones. 90 days went by. The Parker Hale Trust was reviewed. It happened in a quiet room. A stack of papers. Ethan Cole's voice confirmed the inevitable. The trust is yours now, he told her. Full control. Lynn just nodded. She did not celebrate. Money was no longer an idea to her. It was a shield. She did not buy a palace. She did not change. She did something quieter. She said aloud, the medical debts. Every single dollar. For every person who kept my children alive. Then she created a medical fund for other premature babies. It was anonymous, no fanfare, no credit taken. And she went home. Julian Cross showed up one day, not as a lawyer. He brought groceries. He rolled up his sleeves. He helped her with the bottles. A simple domestic act that felt like a judgment against me. You do not have to, she told him. I know, he answered. That is the point. They were careful, at first, building something I had tried to buy. Julian never demanded anything. He was just there, again and again. His presence was worth more than any promise. One night, they sat outside as the babies slept, with the city lights far away. Julian looked at her. I do not want to be a man who enters your life because of what you endured, he said. I want to be the one who stays because you let me. Tears came to her eyes. I do not need to be saved, she told him. I know, Julian said with a smile. I am just asking to join you, end quote. 2, I am. In the city, I looked out from a much smaller window. The leadership at my old company was now permanent. My name was no longer a brand. It was a warning. I saw pictures sometimes. Never of her. Just shadows of a life that continued without my permission. I never called. Lynn probably never thought of me. On some ordinary Sunday, Julian got on his knee on the floor. My 3 children were between them. He asked her a question. There was no spectacle, no drama. No, action now has consequences, and I will not hesitate. My life with another man. The words were a quiet threat, not to me, to them, to their money. It was brilliant. It was ruthless. She had not come to fight me. She had come to erase me. I saw it all then. The small wedding, the perfect life she was building. Her victory was not revenge. It was a new world, a world without me in it. And as she closed the door on the life that I had built, she stepped into one that she had taken from me, strong, whole, and finally free of my protection. She had won, and I was left with absolutely nothing. I imagined her walking down that aisle. She would move slowly, not from love, but for effect. The air would smell of cheap sentiment. Julian Cross would be waiting, a man of performative calm, a nobody. He would take her hands. He would not speak of destiny. He would speak of choice. She would echo the sentiment, quietly, for everyone to hear, all the hard days. I saw her nod, her eyes steady. It was all a performance aimed at me. They married before the sun set. Later, I pictured her standing alone, watching her children breathe, a sight I had paid for. He would join her, his hand in hers, a silent, pathetic scene. Across the city, I was in another room. I watched the same sun go down. I sat behind a glass desk that was no longer mine. The quiet was heavy. The deference was gone. A news alert flashed on my phone. An award given to someone else. I ignored it. I had tried to start again. Small ventures, smaller deals. They never rose to the heights I commanded. It was not a lack of skill. It was trust. Once it is broken, it never mends. I thought of her sometimes. The anger was gone. Something heavier remained. It was regret. I believed my power was a shield. That belief cost me everything. Back in that garden, she raised a glass. To second chances, she would say, a quiet toast to my defeat. There was no victory speech about me. My own choices had already defeated me. Time, law, and my own hand. The perfect tragedy. I pictured them as a family. She carried one child. He carried another, moving forward into a life I was meant to erase. That night, she would stand by a window, the ring on her finger a constant reminder. She would remember the hospital, the day everything was taken from her. But she would smile. Not because she won, but because she endured. I would spend my life explaining, trying to piece together what went wrong. She would spend hers simply living. That was the final insult. The greatest justice was not my fall. It was the quiet, full life she built in my shadow. A life filled with love and dignity, and all the things I was certain she could not have without me. So my story ends, and you are still listening. Something about my downfall must have resonated with you. Perhaps it felt familiar, a time you were wronged, a moment you were underestimated, a time you had to begin again with nothing. Stories like mine matter. They are a warning. We do not control events. We only control our reaction. Some dead philosopher said that. He said it is not what happens, but how you react that matters. She did not win by destroying me. She won because she chose quiet dignity. She chose patience. She chose presence. Healing begins when we accept what is. I never accepted it. I only resented it. So, let me ask you something. What did Grant Holloway actually lose? Was it the company, the board seat, the investors? No, those were consequences. What he truly lost was something he never believed he possessed in the first place: the chance to be loved by someone who would have stood beside him through anything. Think about that for a moment. Lynn Parker did not marry a monster. She married a man who somewhere along the way decided that vulnerability was weakness, that tenderness was a liability, that the people closest to him were assets to be managed, not souls to be cherished. And the tragedy, the real tragedy, is not that he fell. It is that he built the entire machine that crushed him, bolt by bolt, signature by signature, with his own hand. Grant believed the world ran on contracts, on leverage, on the cold math of profit and loss. And for a while, it looked like he was right. He sat at the head of every table. He controlled every room. He made the rules, and everyone played by them. But here is what Grant never understood. The world does not run on contracts alone. It runs on trust. And trust is not something you can buy, negotiate, or enforce with a legal team. Trust is earned in the small, invisible moments, the ones that never make it into a quarterly report. Lynn did not defeat Grant with money. She did not defeat him with lawyers, though she had both in the end. She defeated him with presence. She showed up. Every single day, she walked into that hospital, sat behind that glass, and she was there. For 3 tiny lives that the world's most powerful man had written off as budget lines. That is not weakness. That is the kind of strength that empires cannot buy. And here's the part that should keep every one of us awake tonight. Grant had every advantage: wealth, influence, legal power, a network of people who owed him favors. He had the entire system tilted in his direction, and it was not enough, because you cannot build a fortress out of fear and call it a home. You cannot strip someone of everything and expect silence to mean surrender. Sometimes silence is not defeat. Sometimes silence is a woman learning exactly how long to wait before the man who hurt her hands over the evidence himself. Lynn's patience was not passive. It was strategic. But more than that, it was principled. She never sought revenge. She never gave an interview. She never stood on the courthouse steps and declared victory. She simply lived. She paid the medical debts. She created a fund for other families. She let a good man into her life, not because she needed saving, but because she chose partnership over isolation. That is what healing looks like. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady, quiet, and relentless. Now let me speak directly to you. Maybe you are watching this because you know what it feels like to be dismissed, to have someone look at your pain and call it inconvenient, to be told your love, your effort, your very presence does not matter. If that is you, I need you to hear this clearly. You are not a line item. You are not a liability. You are not an asset to be liquidated when someone decides you no longer serve their ambition. Your worth is not determined by the person who failed to see it. Your value does not decrease because someone chose not to invest in it. And your story, your real story, does not end the moment someone walks away. It begins. Grant Holloway spent his final days explaining, justifying, rewriting history in his own mind. Lynn Parker spent hers living, raising her children, building something real. That is the difference between a man who controls and a woman who endures. One collapses when the system breaks. The other was never depending on the system in the first place. So here's the lesson. Power without compassion is a countdown. Control without love is a cage. And the person locked inside it is always the one holding the key. The strongest thing you will ever do is not dominate a room. It is show up for the people who need you when showing up costs you everything. Grant thought silence meant surrender. Lynn proved that silence can be the loudest thing in the room. Remember that. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful storytelling and life lessons. All characters, names, and events in this story are entirely fictional. Any resemblance to real persons, living or deceased, or actual events is purely coincidental. This story is intended for educational and entertainment purposes. To explore themes of resilience, accountability, and the true meaning of strength. Viewer discretion is advised.